Donald Trump's carrier ploy was a repudiation of traditional conservatism and the essence of National Socialism. Three salvos in store this time around, ladies and gentlemen. The first one from syndicated columnist George Wallace, who points out that Donald Trump's carrier ploy was, as I just alluded to in the open, a repudiation of traditional conservatism. So this is the new conservatism, or pardon me, the new cuck-servatism's recipe for restored greatness. Political coercion shall supplant economic calculation and shaping decisions by companies in what is called with diminishing accuracy the private sector. This will be done partly as cuck-servatism's challenge to liberalism's supremacy in the victimhood sweepstakes, telling aggrieved groups, white people in this case, that they are helpless victims of vast impersonal forces against which they can be protected only by government interventions. Responding to political threats larded with the money of other people, Carrier, the air conditioning manufacturer in Indiana, has somewhat modified its planned transfers of some manufacturing to Mexico, where it's cheap, where labor is cheaper. It's cheaper to operate. This represents the dawn of true bipartisanship. The Republican Party now shares one of progressivism's defining aspirations, government industrial policy, with the political class picking winners and losers within and between economic sectors. This always involves the essence of socialism. Capital allocation whereby government overrides market signals about the efficient allocation of scarce resources. Therefore, it inevitably subtracts from economic vitality and job creation. See, it's a lot more complicated now. The last 8 years, it was real easy. Barack Obama's the enemy, and we're the good guys. Now, there's not a dime's worth of difference between the two parties. The Democrat Party has been defeated only to be replaced by the Republican Party, which is just like it. Thanks to Donald Trump and Trumplicans. Although the president-elect has yet to dip a toe into the swamp, he practices the calculus by which Washington reasons, the political asymmetry between dispersed costs and concentrated benefits. The damages from government interventions are cumulatively huge, but individually are largely invisible. Whereas the beneficiaries are few but identifiable, and their gratitude is, of course, telegenic. And you people thought Trump wasn't a politician, huh? He's always been a politician. When speaking at the Carrier plant, incoming Vice President Mike Cuck Pence said, and I quote, "The free market has been sorting it out and America's been losing." You know, if that were really the case, well then America would deserve to lose. Because America can't compete. You ever thought about that, Trumplicans? That maybe America deserves to lose because America can't compete. And the reason why can't America compete? Socialism, statism, mercantilism, protectionism, government industrial policy. Straight out of the People's Republic of China. How's that for irony, by the way? Trump, of course, because he can't let anybody have the spotlight or upstage him in any way, chimed in every time, every time. Yeah, there's a patriot for you. When Republican leaders denounce the free market as consistently harmful to Americans, they are repudiating almost everything conservatism has affirmed, not to mention sounding exactly like the Democrats they've replaced. Edmund Burke taught that respect for a free society's spontaneous order would immunize politics from ruinous overreaching, from the hubris of believing that we have the information and power to order society by political willfulness, or as Trump put it, I alone can fix America. In an analogous argument, Friedrich Hayek warned against the fatal conceit of believing that wielders of political power can supplant the market's efficient mechanism for digesting dispersed information. The Republican Party is saying goodbye to all of that in their headlong rush to become just like the Democrats they've replaced. The state of Indiana's involvement in the carrier drama exemplifies the entrepreneurial federalism, states competing to lure businesses. Now, this is neither new nor necessarily reprehensible, but there are, however, distinctions to be drawn between creating a favorable climate for business generally and giving direct subsidies to alter the behavior of businesses already operating within the state. And when ad hoc corporate welfare, including tariffs, becomes national policy, it becomes a new arena of regulation and hence of rent-seeking, which inevitably corrupts politics. Want to get money out of politics? Don't follow Trumpnomics. And by sapping economic dynamism, guess what, Trumplicans? It injures the working class. Donald Trump is your enemy, not your friend. The most widely discussed and properly praised book germane to today's politics is J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy, about the sufferings and pathologies of the white working class, largely of Scots-Irish descent in Appalachia and the Rust Belt. This cohort, from which Vance comes, is, he says, one of America's most distinctive subcultures, particularly in its tenacious clinging to traditional mores, many of them destructive. His book has often been misread as primarily about the toll taken by economic forces, globalization, automation, etc. Actually, Vance casts a cool eye on the theory that if they only had better access to jobs, other parts of their lives would improve as well. His primary concern is with lack of agency and learned helplessness, the passive acceptance of victim status. And boy, you know, Trumplicans, you don't even realize it, that you have made of yourselves just another victim class. You just, the victims of these shadowy forces, conspiracies, the Illuminati, the bankers, cabal, and all that other bullshit you see on InfoWars and Breitbart. One theory of the 2016 election is that the white working class rebelled not just against economic disappointments, but also against condescension, demanding not just material amelioration, but even more recognition of its dignity. It is, however, difficult for people to believe in their own dignity when they believe that their choices are powerless to alter their lives' trajectories. In other words, you want to be treated with dignity, white working class? Make yourselves worthy of it. Act like you deserve it. Instead of following after the tangerine Thor. Eventually, The white working class will detect the condescension in the government's message that their fortunes are determined not by things done by them, but by things done to them. Oh, will they? I'm not so sure about that. Such people are susceptible to charismatic presidential leadership. In other words, they like strong men who will save them. They want saviors. How is this different from the past 8 years, Trumplicans? Yes, charismatic presidential leadership with its promise that executive power without limits can deliver them from unhappiness by delivering to them public goods. How is this different from the past 8 years? Isn't that what we've had for the past 8 years under Barack Obama? Executive power without limits, promising deliverance from unhappiness and to public goods? It's the same thing. The only thing that's changed is the beneficiary constituencies. That's the only thing that's changed. Otherwise, exactly the same. Obama to Trump is a seamless transition, with the exception of skin color. That's it. Still a dictator, still a socialist. In contrast, there was dignity in the Joad family of John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. When the Dust Bowl smothered Oklahoma, the Joads were not enervated. They moved west in search of work. What formerly was called conservatism resisted the permeation of society by politics, and particularly by the sort of unconstrained executive power that has been wielded by the 44th President of the United States. The man who will be the 45th forthrightly and comprehensively repudiates the traditional conservative agenda and in reversing it embraces his predecessor's executive swagger. A seamless transition, ladies and gentlemen, a seamless transition. Next up, Ian Tuttle at nationalreview.com, who points out, Trumplicans, that picking winners and losers works only for the elites, the chosen few. If you're a business, Donald Trump, just like every good socialist, is making it hard to plan for the future. Last week, President-elect Trump intervened to keep the Carrier Air Conditioner Company from moving part of its operation to Mexico and shutting down its plant in Huntington, Indiana. Then, on Tuesday morning of last week, Trump tweeted that aerospace firm Boeing was overcharging to design and build the new Air Force One fleet, adding in a brief interview at Trump Tower that he thought Boeing might be doing a little bit of a number. With plenty of American companies looking to lower their bottom line, Trump will no doubt locate a new company of concern next week. It's hardly unprecedented, of course. The United States has a long history of federal intervention in the affairs of large companies, and always for the worst. It's not impossible, though it's perhaps improbable, that Trump's deal with Carrier will end up in the country's best interest once they get their lavish federal subsidies. And as pointed out recently, it's not unreasonable to ask whether the federal government is getting the best bang for its buck in defense contracts, the Pentagon or I guess it will now be known as the Trumpagon, not being the most conscientious of spenders. But it's not clear yet that President-elect Trump's interest in Carrier and Boeing is part of a coherent approach to big business. Trump is big business, remember? Many firms are considering offshoring jobs because it's so infernally costly to make things in the United States. You want to do Carrier a favor? Do everybody a favor by deregulating and by cutting the corporate tax rate, which is the highest in the industrialized world. Shrink government. I really don't care who Donald Trump appoints to head the EPA or Interior or Labor or HHS or HUD. I don't care. All of these things, all of these agencies, all of these cabinet-level departments should be abolished. Tell me that these people are being appointed to head these respective agencies in order to oversee their demolition. I don't care. Whoa, we got Mike Pruitt to head the EPA. What wonderful. Are you going to get rid of it? If not, then I don't give a shit. Why was Carrier favored in this case? Remember who owns them? United Technologies. The government has more than 1 million defense contractors. Why single out Boeing, another defense contractor, in addition to United Technologies, who owns Carrier? Will the president intervene with every firm that offshores? Yes, he will! Will he squint at every defense contract? Unfortunately, there is the distinct impression that Trump is primarily responding to whichever events happen to penetrate his deranged, demented consciousness. This would, of course, fit the Trump mode. It was just a few weeks ago that he tweeted about flag burning because he'd seen protesters burning flags on a Fox News broadcast. And perhaps singling out a few firms is meant to send a message to others. But at first blush, this does not look like a foundation for a healthy economy. Rather, it looks like arbitrary government intervention. Socialism. Or a continuation of the past 8 years for at least the next 4. Is that what you were voting for, Trump supporters? Because you could have gotten that just as easily with Hillary Clinton. Like we told you! But now it has an R attached to it. Being a businessman, and an incompetent businessman at that, Donald Trump is surely well aware of the problem this presents. I'm not so sure about that. To succeed, businesses need to be able to make long-term investments. That is, they need to be able to make strategic decisions whose payoff is not immediate. Those are real investments, not the BS Donald Trump kind. Infrastructure and stimulus and the like. But that requires a stable business climate. One that is not subject to arbitrary rules changes. F.A. Hayek in The Road to Serfdom put it this way, quote, "The rule of law means that government in all its actions is bound by rules fixed and announced beforehand. Rules that make it possible to foresee with fair certainty how the authority will use its coercive powers in given circumstances and to plan one's individual affairs on the basis of this knowledge. Thus, within the known rules of the game, the individual is free to pursue his personal ends, certain that the powers of government will not be used deliberately to frustrate his efforts." End of quote. But President-elect Trump has not signaled that he will aim to foster a climate in which businesses can plan for their future. He has signaled that he will intervene without warning to prohibit individual business decisions he does not like. How does that make him any different from Barack Hussein Obama? That is, as Trump's defenders might say, disruptive. But disruption should be a temporary way station on the way to fixed and announced policies that give businesses the comfort of mind to plan for their futures. Rather, based on what we know of Donald Trump, Carrier and Boeing may turn out to be the first in a parade of companies randomly anointed or condemned from on high. Unfortunately, President-elect Trump does not seem to understand that in an economy of arbitrarily chosen winners, most of us end up as losers. But I think he does understand that, because Donald Trump is the essence of socialism. And now, the conclusion, the bottom line from Kevin Williamson, National Review. Donald Trump is, well, as socialists like to call themselves, the ultimate progressive. And I'm not talking about a brand of watery slop soup either. That's progressive. Oh, but close enough. Progressive is a funny word. It is what the self-consciously center-left element in American politics started calling itself after the word liberal was made into a term of abuse by the center-right element in American politics, which is made up mainly of, well, liberals. Funny little eccentricities of the language. There are, among our so-called liberal Democrats, few surviving liberals and a rapidly declining number of small d Democrats. And thanks to the efforts of such excellent gentlemen as Jonah Goldberg and Glenn Beck in explaining the ugly history of American progressivism, progressive has become a term of abuse as well, especially on the talk radio cable news right, which is why some people get so very upset when you point out that Donald Trump is a progressive. The anti-Trump right, or in other words, true conservatives, true constitutionalists, has an interest in establishing that conservatism is not Trumpism. But there's more to it than that. Trump's progressivism has to be understood in the context of his political and ideological forebears, many of whom are our contemporary self-proclaimed progressives do not wish to claim. Among them, George Wallace and the segregationist Southern Democrats who lorded over American domestic politics between the Great Depression and the Reagan era. Let me begin by anticipating a complaint. Progressives will complain that one cannot in good faith describe Trump as a progressive because contemporary progressives do not much like him and indeed oppose him strongly, even to the point of unreason. But that's just I was going to say it in 2 words, but I'll use a whole sentence. That opposition, however, is not rooted in deep disagreements over policy or ideology, but in pure tribalism. Remember how I talked about how the left hated Richard Nixon, even though Richard Nixon was as far to the left as the liberal Democrats of his day? That it was just pure tribalism because Nixon had an R after his name and he busted Alger Hiss. It didn't matter that Nixon was a liberal in domestic policy. It didn't matter that Nixon effectively surrendered to both the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. It didn't matter. It didn't matter that Nixon lost the Vietnam War. Didn't matter. Nixon was a lefty, but Nixon had an R after his name, and so he was the enemy. And that's why today's left opposes Donald Trump, even though they really don't disagree much on policy or ideology. Donald Trump thinks that free trade deals are depressing American wages and that an open borders immigration regime is the work of Wall Street and big business interests trying to undermine the American working class, or at least that's what he claims to think. Well, guess what? Bernie Sanders thinks that too. Trump, sitting on his golden toilet bowl on Fifth Avenue, somehow emerged as the tribune of the rural working classes, while Sanders, who represents one of the whitest and most rural states, was the favorite of urban cosmopolitans. Which is weird enough, but consider that they did it while pushing policy agendas that were substantially identical in many fundamental ways. But the fact that a candidate pushing classic progressivism rubs most progressives the wrong way does not alter his commitment to progressivism, which is to say, to the preference for the political regimentation of society over laissez-faire economic policies and organic social development. The central public policy question of American progressivism, as Walter Nugent puts it in his useful Progressivism, a very short introduction, from the beginning has been, quote, how could economic life be made fair again? Classical progressives, he writes, Walter Nugent, favored using some form or degree of government to regulate economic problems, ameliorate social ills, and reconcile change with tradition. The first two are still very much the central concerns of progressives, though reconciling change with tradition has been thrown overboard in these days of prosecuting nonconformist bakers as civil rights villains. Woodrow Wilson, the father of American progressivism, would no doubt have vexed modern progressives with his backward and primitive racial views, which Donald Trump kind of sort of shares, by the way. Views that were backward and primitive even by the standards of his time. Those conservative, quote-unquote, Southern Democrats were in the main recognizable as modern progressives, as indeed was George Wallace. They were supporters of social insurance and welfare state programs, minimum wage laws, and much, if not all, other pro-labor regulation, with Wallace being an energetic opponent of right-to-work laws. They supported the trust-busting and anti-monopoly projects and generally favored a strong regulatory hand on business, particularly on international trade and banking. Southern segregationists such as Wallace and Theodore Bilbo were notoriously fond of extravagant public works spending. Is this sounding familiar? And as governor, Bilbo was a notable champion of progressive measures such as compulsory education, bank regulation, and public health projects. Obamacare! Obamacare! Excuse me. This stands in broad contrast to the conservative Republicans of the era, who were, for their part, mainly recognizable as modern conservatives. Anti-tax, anti-spending, anti-New Deal, small government men, including arch-conservatives such as Mr. Republican Robert Taft, who also attempted to put together a far-reaching civil rights bill in 1946, a project scuttled by progressives. But don't take my word for it. You can read Ira Katznelson on this stuff, or Ta-Nehisi Coates, or dozens of left-leaning scholars, or even better, you can go back and look at the actual records of those segregationist Democrats on issues like the creation of Social Security, the Davis-Bacon Act, bank regulations, etc., etc., etc. The point of all this is not to argue that modern progressives ought to be tarred with the racism of their intellectual forebears, much less to suggest that modern progressives are in the main racists, covertly or otherwise, although they pretty much are. Rather, the point is to establish the opposite. Progressivism is not a set of cultural inclinations, but a body of public policy views, mainly economic, along with related assumptions about the role and capacities of government. The contemporary left's attempt to define conservative as bigotry and progressivism as liberation from such bigotry is juvenile, and it is historically illiterate. The American left is, for all practical purposes, entirely progressive, which is to say, entirely committed to a managerial view of the role of government rooted in implacable, indeed irrational hostility to the laissez-faire posture. But there is a progressive element within the right as well. William F. Buckley, himself no stranger to the practical uses of populism, and National Review opposed Wallace energetically, but not all conservatives did. And the same dynamic played out with Trump, with one important difference. Trump won. Oh, he is not, to be sure, a poisonous racist on the Wallace model. That's why he's got Stephen Bannon. He's not a Pat Buchanan-style culture warrior either. I mean, good Lord, he transgenderized the bathrooms in Trump Tower, for heaven's sake. Being more of a Twitter troll, he may or may not be as crazy as H. Ross Perot, the prior presidential candidate he most closely resembles. And what he actually will do in office is anybody's guess, although I think we have a pretty good idea. We're already seeing it. But we should try to understand where it is we find ourselves on the political spectrum. Trump may be culturally attached to the right, or rather, more precisely, the right may be culturally attached to Trump, which is why they've abandoned their principles. But everything he has said and done thus far points to his being a progressive in the ancient mold of Woodrow Wilson, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, and yes, George Wallace and Theodore Bilbo. He means to put trade, and probably much more than trade, under political discipline. He means to stand between buyers and sellers with his hand out, making demands. He has expressed a longing for Keynesian stimulus projects, mercantilism, income theft, Bismarckian welfare statism, and the consolidation of political power within the executive. In other words, he's an orange version of Barack Obama. He may talk like Archie Bunker, but politically he is Barack Obama rebranded for talk radio. Amen, brother. If we take Trump at his word, this is shaping up to be a case of talk right, govern left. And you Trump supporters out there, of all, whatever your stripe, whether you're the Trumplican cultists, whether you are the Hillary Scarecrow crowd conservatives, you are the biggest suckers of all, just like Never Trumpers have been telling you for the past year and a half. Parenthetically, let's get in the Trumplican quarters that I frequent. They've gotten kind of quiet all of a sudden. Oh, I'm not saying they've already started figuring out, oh my God, what have we done? I just find it interesting when they get quiet. It's like, because I haven't stopped. I haven't stopped these conservative Ronin videos. I haven't stopped posting that Trump is what we've always said he was and is. Just the silence is just, it's not golden yet, but it's intriguing. That's a good word for it at this stage of the game. And power-worshipping and power-starved Republicans are going along with this talk right, govern left deception as quickly and as cravenly as they can. Mike Cuck Pence has declared himself a fundamental opponent of free markets. This is that corruption I've been talking about for all these months. Quondam conservatives such as Henry Olson of the Ethics and Public Policy Center defend in instances of pure crony capitalism, corporate welfare, such as the carrier bailout, insisting that free market advocates must stomach these in the name of doing what is politically sustainable. In other words, we are all socialists now! You know who originally coined that term? Richard Nixon. Pro-lifers and immigration hawks spent many years listening to similar demands that they abandon their principles in the name of popularity. But tastes change, politics change, and the electorate is fickle at best. Which you Trumplicans are going to find out in 2018 and 2020. I'm telling you again right now. There was a time, not long ago, when Republicans complained that with Democrats in possession of the White House and the Senate, they controlled only 1/2 of 1/3 of the government, as Darrell Issa put it. Well, Republicans now control the entirety of the elected federal government, and on a good day can win at the Supreme Court too. The conservatives, here meaning conservatives, true conservatives, never Trumpers, the people who believe in limited government, laissez-faire, free trade, free enterprise, a shrewd and steady national security policy, may not control even that 1/2 of 1/3 that Issa found inadequate. And does not. Republican Party has become the Democrat Party. And the Democrat Party has become, I don't know, Communist Party USA. Everything has moved left, in other words, just like it always has. Who is in control, you may be asking, rhetorically? A man with Otto von Bismarck's conception of the state and Ed Anger's temperament. George Wallace without the experience in office. He and a great many self-abasing hangers-on hypnotized by the prospect of power, like Narcissus in a house of mirrors. Conservatives said that the great triumph of the Reagan years was a Democrat Party so chastened that it nominated Bill Clinton, the reluctant welfare reformer and free trader who, by his own rueful reckoning, pursued the policies of an Eisenhower Republican. The great triumph of the Obama years, for progressives anyway, is a Republican Party so debased that it happily embraces Trump and Trumpism, which is to say, National Socialism. I wonder if Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are smart enough to appreciate the scale and significance of their victory.